Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. Israel's two Palestinian fronts at its center in Jerusalem and the West Bank and in the southern west in Gaza have been relatively quiet over the last 2 weeks, save for the occasional terror attack or incident, but danger seems to lurk in the north, including in Syria, where Iran proactively seeks to entrench militarily, and Lebanon, where the Iranian-proxy Hezbollah is determined to claim its position as the country's arbiter. Which of the two are more severe, and are we to expect a possible conflict in the near to medium future? Joining our discussion today, all the way from northern Israel, is Major General in Reserve Gershon Hacohen, who is a former IDF Army Corps commander. Thank you for joining us, General.
Thank you.
Also joining us from elsewhere here in Jerusalem is Dr. Boms, who is a research fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. Thank you for also joining us, Dr. Boms. And with me in the studio is, of course, our TV7 editor-at-large and host of Watchmen Talk, Powers and Play, and so much more, Amir Oren. Amir, could you please provide us with an overview, if you will, an assessment of Israel's northern front, and which of the two, Lebanon or Syria, is more of a danger these days to the state of Israel?
You know, Jonathan, we've shown one of our pictures here for this program had Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, along with Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Aviv Kochavi, and we have it. And Nasrallah has been in power for the last 30 years. Kochavi is the 9th Chief of Staff of the IDF that Nasrallah has seen come and go. And very soon he will have his 10th Chief of Staff.
And he still remains in his bunker.
Yes, for more than a half of this period of 3 decades, he has been hiding in his bunker. And part of the reason for his longevity is that he knows how not to provoke Israel. So one has to distinguish between the very militant words that he is pronouncing once in a while, including recently regarding the maritime boundary between Israel and Lebanon. And as you said, the reason is, above all, that Hezbollah wants to have a say about what is happening within Lebanon. Now, Nasrallah has managed to deter Israel from undertaking certain military actions within Lebanon and even against Lebanese persons outside of Lebanon. Israel has been very careful not to kill any Hezbollah emissary or fighter in Syria. You can see that in all of the reported Israeli raids in Syria, none of the Hezbollah people there was hurt, and it was deliberate. Within Syria, of course, Israel has been fighting Iran and its proxies, the Shiite militias, but also Israel has been very careful not to have any friction with the Russian forces there. Only recently, a few days ago, we have seen the drone attack on the American and Syrian Democratic Forces garrison at Atanf, which is, of course, between
the so-called Green Village.
Yes, between Iraq, Syria, and Jordan. But this is probably apart from the general campaign which is being undertaken there.
Plenty of complexities. Nevertheless, we would like also to hear our distinguished guests, including General Hacohen. You also have had quite the vision for Israel's defenses on the north and beyond. Could you provide us insight? What should be considered today, in your view, the most challenging element or threat to the state of Israel?
First of all, I agree with what was just summarized by Amir. And the main question is how we can go ahead with understanding Hezbollah and Nasrallah threatening against Israel. The way he is threatening Israel, even to escalate to a war regarding the conflict in the sea, about the gas, we must really take seriously that new grade of escalation in threatening, in declarations, and yet we can really be quite responsible by not really making alarm to a war. It means that he has a lot of considerations, Nasrallah, to go to the edge. Actually, what we are really facing is what is known in criminal games as a chicken game. They are driving the car, the Israelis are driving the Israeli car, and one of two cars must go to the side of the road. Otherwise, we will have an accident. And he is really sure that again and again, the Israelis will take the rational step and go to the side. And in that, he's always going ahead with new escalation and yet promising himself from gliding to unnecessary war in his own terms. So actually, this is a situation not only about the conflict in the sea, it is the same about the freedom of Air Force to fly above Lebanon. He's really equipping himself in Hezbollah with new Iranian and Russian air defense system, and still keeping constraints, not really to use them without absolute control. So the potential for just escalating the situation to war is existing. The rationality behind the whole decision-making still keeping the Israeli understanding that yet we are not really just one step for a war.
Indeed. Dr. Boms, your perspective on this?
Well, let's look at Lebanon and Syria, looking at some similarities and differences. Both are now broken states. Syria, before the war, was an old style autocracy, controlled by one man, one family, one tribe with an iron fist. But if we are moving forward, following the Arab Spring, the Syrian war, and many other events that we've discussed even in this program, we're now seeing a broken country with a ruler that is really found at the mercy of other parties, certainly the Iranians, but also the Russians, and in other parts as well, with American influence, Turkish influence, and more. This, in a way, is also a partial insurance policy for Israel, because a mass escalation in Syria depends also on some of the other parties there. And it certainly, if it's going to happen, it's not going to happen because of President Assad, but really because of the other elements, and particularly the Iranian and Hezbollah elements that are there, trying, as you said, to entrench them across the border. So really, when we're looking at the danger, we're still looking at the Hezbollah as the main danger, and the Syrian front as an extension of the Lebanese one. What's happening in Lebanon and what's happening with Hezbollah, and the reason why Nasrallah finds himself really inside the bunker, is because in the last 15 years, aside from spending some time in the bunker, he's been collecting things, mainly missiles. And when you collect over 130,000 missiles, and when you are making them more accurate with the help of your Iranian patrons, it means that you are preparing to what General Hacohen said, you're preparing to a potential strike. Sure, there are many reasons why not to do it right now, but if there's going to be a possibility for doing it, there's going to be circumstances, then the infrastructure is there. Which is why, of course, Israel needs to keep on working to limit these activities and making sure that there's not going to be another front in Syria. But I think if we're looking at this conceptually, the Lebanese front is the main one. The Syrian front is really developed as an extension of it, It is less dangerous, but that's why it's important to make sure that it's not going to be more dangerous. And this is really the explanation for all the activity and the intensified activity and the recent activity that we've seen in the last 2 years by Israel in the Syrian front.
Indeed. Mr. Oren, well, we'll discuss also the maritime issue, which General Hacohen, as well as you, have highlighted. I'd like to touch on another point, which also General Hacohen mentioned, and that is Israel's freedom of aerial maneuver, something that Israel has been very vigorous about. This is one of its red lines. Of course, something that it went as far as to establish a deconfliction mechanism with the Russians, and able to ensure that its red lines with regard to Iranian entrenchment in Syria particularly, but of course also transit of weaponry, sophisticated weaponry at that, into Lebanon would be thwarted. Do you see this as something that could also provoke miscalculation?
Well, there's a difference between what the Israeli Air Force wants to maintain over Syria and over Lebanon. Over Syria, Israel wants to have the freedom of attack, as you referred to it, but it can also attack targets in Syria from the ground. It has enough rockets, artillery, missiles, and sometimes even tanks if the targets are right across the border, as Gershon Hacohen obviously remembers from his days as the division commander there on the Golan Heights. Above Lebanon, the problem is keeping the continuity of intelligence coverage, because it is not enough to have just a surveillance pass once every week or even every few days. Of course, you have satellites, but in order to keep continuous coverage, especially of sensitive items and movements, you must be able to fly above Lebanon. Of course, even if you fly above the sea, a few dozen miles west of Lebanon, you can still have a good enough picture. But you want to maintain it the way air forces always do. Now, regarding miscalculation, the problem stems from Nasrallah's propensity to miscalculate, for which he already recanted or apologized about 2006. Nasrallah, as a very, very avid watcher of what is happening in Israel, a follower of the Israeli media, and by the way, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Palestinian organizations in general, rely a lot on open source intelligence, what is called OSINT. They follow the Israeli media and try to decipher the intentions of the Israeli leadership from it. What he has seen recently in Operation Breaking Dawn against the Palestinian Islamic Jihad must make him realize that, for instance, the modus operandi of Defense Minister Benny Gantz, first when he was Chief of Staff 10 years ago during Operation Pillar of Defense in Gaza, and now again in Gaza in Operation Breaking Dawn, is starting the operation with what is called in professional circles decapitation or targeted killing of leaders. In Gaza, it was the Chief of Staff of Hamas, Ahmed Jabri, and now it was another Jabri, the brigade commander in the north of Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And Nasrallah must understand that he is going to be the first and prime target when an Israeli operation comes. So this will give him another reason to be very, very cautious. His own life is at stake. It is not only the organization or the nation of Lebanon or what his Iranian masters will tell him if he miscalculates. So this should make him think twice before he does anything stupid.
Maybe reconstruct the bunker into more subterranean elements. General Hacohen, I'd like also to hear your take on this, on the aerial element of this calculus, and to what degree do you see this? You established a metaphor of the criminal vehicular exercise of chicken. Is there a point in which the inevitable collision of this metaphor would come about?
Yes, of course, the last operation can really exemplify the fact that something is changing in the Israeli leadership, even regarding the new Prime Minister Yair Lapid. In a time of emergency, he can take decisions to enter into a new engagement, like the decision in the last operation. And this decision-making in itself is an alarm to Nasrallah that something is going differently in the Israeli decision-making at the high level, at the political level. Much more than that, actually, Nasrallah will make every effort to promise himself not to find all his troops in a new engagement without control. But he is always improving his position. In the border, they are really building now new positions with a permanent presence, what was not allowed to them in the last UN resolution 1701 that really declared demilitarization of South Lebanon, and step by step, and now they are doing that permanently without trying to do that at dark night. They are doing that in open to every observation. So this is another step to change the situation, the environmental operational readiness of all his troops.
Indeed. Dr. Boms, I'd like to hear your take on this, but also from the initiator's perspective as Israel executed the Breaking Dawn operation in quite the determined application, but on the same time, it was also quite vigorous in executing all of its goals within that operation as quickly as possible, and devastated the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, another Iranian extension, of course, from the Palestinian angle. Is this once again echoing some remnants from the Six-Day War, which was, of course, initiated at the time by Israel and ultimately concluded in resounding victory, something that resonates at this stage within the powerhouses of Israel's enemies?
Well, I would say I hope so, and perhaps another reference to it. When Israel was established, actually, before so, we used to have something that was called a tower and a wall, where the early pioneers needed to put a new community that was legal when it has a tower and a wall around it. They did it at the height of the night and put some facts on the ground. It's important sometimes to put some facts on the ground, and in some ways what we've seen in the Syrian border is the exact same exercise. We have a status quo that somebody needs to define, and that status quo is being challenged by, for example, Hezbollah or Iran-related proxies that are joining the Syrian army, Syrian military directly or indirectly, and find themselves all of a sudden in a position right next to the Israeli border, changing the infrastructure. Israel decided that it's not going to let this happen. And in the last few months, we have seen another change of policy and a more assertive approach when it comes to the Syrian border. And we've seen this also in the war between the wars, with a very clear objective not to allow a type of entrenchment of Iranian forces within Syria, and then not to allow this failed state scenario to strengthen the axis of Hezbollah and the Iranian involvement over there. I hope that what we've seen now is another phase of it, and where, despite of changing leadership, elections that otherwise could be interpreted as a sign of weakness, nobody's paying attention, we can do what we need to do on the other side. Israel is saying, no, we're paying attention, we're watching, and we are going to respond. So better yet, not try to surprise us, because we are going to respond a little bit differently than what you thought. This still does not mean that there is no danger, because again, the difference between a collection of missiles and a collection of stamps can be a very serious one. If you take the stamps to an exhibition, you may enjoy them. If you take the missiles into exhibition, you start a war in where you would not know how it will end. This is why Israel needs to do a lot in order to make sure that it will keep its deterrence, that it's not going to compromise when either Hezbollah or another proxy is trying to challenge it. And this assertiveness that we've seen, including in Gaza, is a clear indication that Israel is not willing to change the status quo so quickly.
Responding to facts on the ground rather than to the actions of the enemy, is that something that we can expect also for Syria particularly?
Well, Defense Minister Gantz, in summing up Operation Breaking Dawn, had a very interesting comment intended for all fronts. The Syrian one, the Iranian one, the Lebanese one, the Gaza front. And
from Khan Yunis until Tehran.
Indeed. And he said that if the need arises, Israel will not hesitate to undertake a preventive war. Now, he used a very oblique or opaque term, because he could have meant trying to hit Iran or another target when they are trying to have a nuclear weapon or another sort of force buildup, or he could have meant preempting when Israel knows that the other side is about to launch an attack against it. But if you take this declaration, along with another very interesting comment by Major General Herzi Halevi, the Deputy Chief of Staff, who said a few years ago, when he was in charge of a team of Israeli officers trying to understand how to better defend the northern border, especially the Lebanese border, of which he was the divisional commander a few years ago. What General Halevi said was that if Israel knows that there are attack forces by Hezbollah ready to penetrate, Israel should not wait until they actually do it, but should preempt. For instance, the so-called Radwan forces, the elite Hezbollah forces, if they are on their launching pad or inside tunnels if they manage to dig them, Israel should do it. To sum it up, preemption can be done on both the strategic and operational levels. Now, the generals on Israel's side may recommend hitting Radwan forces first, rather than Nasrallah in Beirut, or a mixture of both. So the enemy should very, very seriously consider Israel's ability and propensity to preempt.
General Hacohen, one of the key ingredients within democratic societies is political will, considering the political instability, if you may, in Jerusalem. Is there a lack of political will to bring about the determination that is necessary in order to defeat an enemy that seeks to find schemes and other operational capabilities within the mixture of such a reality?
Exactly. That's what I tried to describe before. Actually, what was really clear in the last operation is the fact that even though there is a clear political instability in Israel regarding the willingness of leaders to take severe decisions to go to an operation, we can succeed to present a kind of unity. And this is a great indication that Nasrallah, of course, taking seriously. And I'm sure that it was part of a factors that have been considered by Hamas not to enter in the last operation to the game. So Israel really is something very bewildering. In one side, it is with a lot of weakness, political instability. On the other side, due to that weaknesses, there is an emerging of cohesion to take hard decisions.
If I may interject, Jonathan,
One sentence.
the entrance into politics of former Lieutenant General Gadi Eisenkot recently, and he is obviously going to be in the inner circle.
A great military thinker, if I
of
may.
decision makers.
Indeed.
This will make quite a contribution to the Israeli decision-making process.
Dr. Boms, closing sentence from you, if you will, about 30 seconds.
There are many divisions in Israel, but I don't think there is a division that Israel needs to do what it needs to do, and it needs to be assertive as it needs to be in order to tackle this threat. Hezbollah and Iran have spent the last 40 years or more with a very clear goal in mind. If they could have achieved that goal of trying to weaken Israel significantly, or even more so, trying to eliminate it, as the vision is, they would have done that. And I'm glad that what we're seeing, even within the period of transition, is a more assertive line. And I believe that that's what they will see also in the foreseeable future.
Indeed. Sands are shifting. Nevertheless, the calculus is also taking its root. This is all the time that we have for today. So I'd like to thank General Hacohen, Dr. Boms, and Mr. Oren for being part of today's panel. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well. And we will see you next time. And until then, shalom.